Good day, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We have so far about 100 participants joined us up to this point. And as you just heard, this is being recorded. The recording will be made available via the website over the next couple of days. And then the obligatory advisory. This is not a medical presentation. So anything that you hear should not be perceived as advice or guidance. If you have any need to have any medical support, we suggest that you take the information you've gleaned and present that to your medical staff. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark Lichty.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to all of our brothers of the prostate who share in this journey. Take a breath. Take a deep breath. Relax. Enjoy the ride today. We really want to create a sanctuary here where you can feel at peace. We do appreciate your feedback. We try to integrate your feedback. Some of you felt that the webinar went too long, and we want you to know that you can step out anytime. We're not going to be offended, or Ericka's not going to be offended. In fact, we won't even know probably. And all of these are recorded, so you can always come back and see it if you have to leave early. Our purpose is to help men navigate active surveillance, but we also want men to feel more peaceful in that journey. These are very anxious times: pandemic anxiety, climate anxiety, Zoom anxiety. I even had that Zoom anxiety for a moment today when somehow when we were going to get started, my power went out, and so I had to take a deep breath and just focus on what needed to be focused on and not allow the anxiety to come in. And the problem with the anxiety is that anxiety releases cortisol, which doesn't help us in healing or coping. And again, the key that I've found is that if I can take that anxious energy and transform it into something else, that really helps me. And breathing is so important in the control of anxiety. And the thought that came to me this morning was it reminded me of Clint Eastwood's song, which when he was asked why he stayed so young at heart, he said, "I don't let the old man in." And a beautiful, beautiful song. And I say the same thing to all of you that are on the call here. Don't let the anxiety in. It's going to show up at your door, but just don't let it in. I want to just say something about ASPI. It's unique in a number of ways. Our board is made up of all of men who have been on active surveillance. Well, okay, that's with the exception of Alex Schultz. Alex Schultz is the president of Prostate Cancer Research Institute. And her father-in-law, Mark Schultz, has taken the machete and forged a path in active surveillance ahead of his time. As a woman, Alex unfortunately suffers from what I call prostate envy. And we see so much value in the things that she brings to ASPI. And I want to be clear, two of our board members have transitioned to treatment. And that's while we're very much dedicated to active surveillance, we also are very supportive of treatment when necessary. The other thing that makes another thing that makes us unique is that we scan the globe for the best practices about active surveillance, and hence we've had people from Holland and Sweden, and Ericka is from Sweden. So we're doing that, and I don't know of anybody else that's really doing that. And we found Ericka. She wrote a book about the cultural history of the prostate. Unfortunately, Ericka suffers also from prostate envy, and we'll have a little support group on that after the meeting. I'm very excited about this particular webinar because I lived in Sweden over 50 years ago. So I'm always very interested in Scandinavian issues. Now, I wanted to make a mention of next month's topic, and that's going to be on compassionate care and beyond. You might recall Ulla Brott's webinar. And Ulla Brott, when he conveys the cancer diagnosis to a patient with low risk or intermediate risk prostate cancer, he says, "You have no cancer." And he goes on to say that needs to be treated, but the initial words are, "You have no cancer." And my experience 17 years ago was my urologist said, "You have cancer. You need to get a radical prostatectomy." But Mark, I know you well enough, and he knew me well. We were friends. I know you well enough to know you won't do that. So he gave me the name of a guy that was on what was called watchful waiting. The term active surveillance didn't even exist at the time. And I was grateful for that, but there was no access to a nurse, a social, or anybody to talk to. So on this point, we're looking for best practices. For example, have you experienced a diagnosis where somebody referred you to a nurse or a social worker or somebody to talk to? I left my email in the chat box. And so if you've had that kind of an experience, I would be very interested in hearing about it, because it's hard to find that, particularly in the United States. We've found it a little bit in other countries, but not so much in the US. So I'd like to introduce my good friend and board member, Jeff McClellan, and he's going to talk a little bit about helping us to keep the lights on here. So thank you all. Be at peace. It's going to be an enjoyable time together. Jeff?
Thank you very much, Mark. This is Jeff McClellan tuning into you from Northern California, where schools are closed, taxes are high, and politicians are scared. Meanwhile, I want to thank all of our past donors, and I appreciate any future donors and those of you thinking about it. Here we are talking during Black History Month, and I think it's appropriate that Martin Luther King had a pretty good statement that has a tremendous parallel to active surveillance and prostate cancer. That statement being, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the staircase. Taking that first step when you get your first diagnosis, or even when you're waiting for your diagnosis. Mark has mentioned anxiety. And you may go up the staircase fast. You may not even move up the staircase. In both ways, we're blessed to have this community present at the moment online. And the reason I say that is because we have a saying, a motto in this organization. We tend to give you life, education, and the ability to thrive with active surveillance. We really mean that. And in order to do that, we educate you. We educate you with all of the resources that we have, our good contacts, our experts, and there's many of you that I'm sure will pitch in and help us in the future. So to bring everything together, thank you for taking the time to hear me. And please, if you can, give what you may. There's a donor button on our website, or you can contact me or any of the board members. I wish you all well and thrive with active surveillance. Thank you.
Well, you were going to introduce Howard.
I can just introduce myself. Let's move
You're
it
good at that.
along.
Why don't you do that? Good.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Bye.
I'm Howard Walensky, and glad you all made it today. Should note that we had record registration for this meeting, so I think a lot of people are excited about this. I hope so. But let me not only welcome the brothers of the prostate, but the sisters of the prostate. So, and we have one of those speaking today. But today's going to be something different, as Monty Python said. So get ready for something completely different. We usually have medical experts as speakers. Today, we're going to go in a different direction. We're having a doctor of gender and technology studies talk about the secret life of the prostate. What is this mysterious gland? How does it affect our lives, even after it is surgically obliterated? What is the impact on our society and culture from the prostate? And how does active surveillance fit into this social mesh or mess? Our speaker is Ericka Johnson. She's a professor of gender and society at Linköping University in Sweden. She grew up in Minnesota, so she is an American and almost a Canadian, and now a Swede. She studied at Vassar and Oxford and got her doctorate at Linköping, her home for the past 20 years. She has an interdisciplinary background in sociology, gender studies, and science and technology studies. Her work explores how technologies of the body articulate silent understandings, highlight cultural values, and make tangible social norms. She is the author of several monographs and anthologies, including a cultural biography of the prostate from MIT Press. And Mark, we should remember to give people a discount code. Ericka is a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. So please enter any questions in the chat box. Remember, Ericka is a doctor of gender studies, not medicine. So she likely won't answer medical questions. And so, Ericka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen with everyone and get this off of there. Looks like you're all seeing my screen. Howard, I see your face. Can you give me a thumbs up if everything looks all right? Great. And then I'll start. Thank you very much for that introduction and for letting me come and speak today. We came up with this title together, The Secret Life of the Prostate, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad, and there's a lot of ugly with the prostate. I'll probably touch on a bunch of them, but let me talk to you a little bit about this talk, what this talk is going to contain, because like Howard said, I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not going to give you any medical advice. You shouldn't listen to anything I say about that. But I did do a huge study on the prostate from a cultural perspective. And I think there's a lot of things there that can be interesting for people who become prostate patients in one way or another, or are on active surveillance. And also for partners of those people, who I think there might be some of those in the audience today as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that study first, just to give you a frame for what it is that I think that I can say and what I definitely cannot say in terms of the prostate. Then I'm going to go and talk a little bit about the history of the prostate. I'm going to talk a bit about BPH and prostatitis, benign prostate hyperplasia. And then I'm going to talk about the absent prostate, because it appeared in our research a lot, and I was really surprised by that. And I think there's a lot to be said about what the prostate does when it's gone and how it impacts people who have had that prostate from a cultural and a social perspective. And I think we could address the needs that the absent prostate produces a lot better if we can think through those things together. Throughout this study, I'm going to be talking about the results of what we found, but I'm going to try to do it and frame it in a way that asks the question, why should a man on active surveillance care? There are lots of things that I'm going to be talking about where you may be thinking first, this is so distant from my concerns and especially from my fears. And I realized that, like Mark said, there is a lot of anxiety associated with prostate cancer, the prostate in general. Why should a person care about what the cultural aspects of the prostate are when they're actually dealing with a disease or a potentially deadly disease? And I'm also going to frame this conversation around questions about what possible lessons can be learned for prostate patients from women's healthcare activism. Like Howard said, I work at a Department of Gender Studies, and I and the rest of the people I worked with had not a very necessarily solo interest in feminist studies, but we've all had a background in feminist studies and feminist research. And a lot of that has looked at how women's activism has changed healthcare. And I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from studies of women's healthcare activism and could potentially be applied to prostate healthcare and prostate healthcare activism. There was a picture of the book on that last slide. And as Howard mentioned, it's called A Cultural Biography of the Prostate. Why would a book that represents a large study be called that? Well, let me give you some background to the study. It was in 2013. It was given a grant, a very large grant for a social scientist from the Swedish Research Council to run a study, a 6 to 7 year study under the title A Constant Torment, Tracing the Discursive Contours of the Aging Prostate. I came to that title because prior to the study, I had been looking at Viagra and the way that Viagra shaped masculinity in Sweden when it entered into the Swedish healthcare regimes. And one thing that I noticed was that every time Viagra was prescribed, not every time, but often when Viagra was prescribed, there was in the background somewhere, the prostate or prostate problems. And I started to wonder what these prostate problems were. They weren't necessarily always very well defined. And as I was reading about them, I came across phrases like the prostate, a constant torment, or, well, this patient presented with this, and this. It's probably his prostate that is haunting him. And as a medical sociologist, I have to say the idea that an organ or a gland could be a constant torment and haunt a patient or the person whose body it is became really interesting. So I decided I wanted to try to figure out what this gland was when it was being spoken about by medical doctors in medical journals in terms like torment or haunting. And I wanted to do that in an interdisciplinary way. So with this grant, I gathered 9 different researchers. Their names are here on the slide, and some of their pictures are as well, and brought them together for periods anywhere between 2 to 4 years to work with me on different parts of what I thought were really interesting questions about the prostate. We had no medical doctors as part of this study. And that's because I think medical doctors do a lot with the prostate already. I think they do great things with the prostate. I am not opposed to medicine, Western medicine, what it does with the treatment or diagnosis of the prostate. But I thought that there was some other knowledge that needed to be produced as well. So I pulled in a sexologist. I think that was extremely relevant, a woman who's been employed at a urology clinic in central southern Sweden. I had a couple historians, a couple medical sociologists, some anthropologists, and quite a few of us had different experiences with feminist theories and work also with science and technology studies. And I brought them all together. We all approached the prostate from our different disciplinary directions, and that gave us different questions. And it gave us different questions about the prostate and also the prostate in healthcare. And as we together reported our results back together, I started seeing that I was getting very different stories about this prostate. Just as a person who was perhaps writing a biography and will go out and interview the person's mother, the person's wife, the person's children, the person's employer, would also get very different understandings of what that person was. When they go to the archive and look at that person's documents that have been stored historically, that's going to give a very different idea of what that person is, rather than reading personal love letters. By putting all of these different types of understandings, disciplinary approaches to the prostate together, I was able to write a biography of the prostate and try to give different views on how it is and what it does when it appears in our cultural context, in our thoughts and images. So let me talk a little bit first about the history of the prostate. Much of Western medicine, especially a long time ago, Western medicine in the European context, was basing its understandings of the body on the work of the Greek Galen, Greek physician Galen. He never mentions the prostate. So for a large chunk of European history, the prostate was not part of the anatomy books. However, that changed in the 1530s when Vesalius drew what could be interpreted as the prostate right underneath the bladder in a couple of his sketches, which then later became part of his famous anatomy book. So I think a person could pinpoint the discovery, in quotation marks, of the prostate to the 1530s in the West, in the European context. There's a picture of Galen's drawing down there in the small little lower image. But 1530s, that's after Leonardo da Vinci died. So our famous anatomist, Leonardo da Vinci, missed the prostate. Vesalius didn't give it a name. It wasn't until the 1600s that the name prostate became started to appear in anatomy books. And for those of you who are sharp, that is potentially a plural of what would be eventually prostate. But prostate as a noun first appeared in English in the 1700s. At the time, though, there was still a lot of debate. Is the prostate one gland or one organ? Is the prostate two? It seems to be several in some ways of dissecting it. It's part of a system that seems to be symmetrical with two testicles, for example, though it appears just at the place where sperm is let out through one single tube out of the penis. So there was a lot of debate about whether or not it was one gland or several, and if it should be plural or not. By the 1800s, people started calling it a singular gland. They also started associating it with sex. It was not necessarily clear from the beginning what the prostate did and what it does. But by the late 1800s, people were pretty sure that it had something to do with sex and reproduction. And in fact, there were medical doctors who claimed that the main goal of the prostate was to, through contractions, shoot out the sperm with enough force that it would hit the cervix during intercourse with such strength that it would cause the female orgasm and thereby help with fertility, with fertilization. I'm sure most of you realize that that's not how most women come. But at the time, that's what people were thinking. There was also another reason that it was associated with sex, and that is because it seemed to appear in many cases in association with, or prostate problems seem to appear in older men in association with gonorrhea. Of course, at this point, we know that a lot of the prostate problems that we identify as being specifically related to the prostate aren't related to gonorrhea. But at the time, before before we had antibiotics to cure gonorrhea, a man who was, say, in his 60s and had gonorrhea had probably gotten it fairly early in life and had been dealing with a low-grade infection for decades, and that had caused internal scarring in the urethra, which caused the same sorts of problems that we associate with, for example, the growth of the prostate now in BPH or other types of tumors growing in the prostate. So there was a real discussion and uncertainty about how the prostate itself was related to sex in general, but more specifically, sex that was outside the norms of what was deemed appropriate at the time. For this reason, the prostate itself was oftentimes also given the credit for older men who were maybe behaving in a way that the rest of society at the time didn't think was quite appropriate. So the prostate would sometimes, at the late 1800s, be blamed for a man who in his later years married another wife, a much younger one, and was much more active than was thought appropriate. So the prostate itself was also historically associated with potentially causing an overactive sexuality. I could go on and on with examples of this, but one thing that's kind of interesting about it is that because of this, and also because of some of the observations that had been made at the time in the late 1800s in women's bodies about removing the ovaries in women and the effects that that would have on both their psyche and potentially also on the treatment of benign tumors in the uterus, there was a brief period in time when European doctors, and to some degree also American doctors, suggested castrating men in order to deal with enlarged prostates. This is something that they stopped doing relatively quickly because it didn't seem to really work, and also the patients were not particularly keen on that treatment. But it was a historical manifestation of the way that doctors were associating the prostate with particular patterns of behavior, and also looking to see how that type of behavior could be controlled in other bodies, in this case, women's bodies, and trying to bring that knowledge into prostate treatments. One point I want to take out from this slide is that at the time, the prostate was primarily known as it appeared in dissections. Of course, it was still possible to feel the prostate for a doctor to examine up through the digital rectal exam, as is done today as well. But most knowledge about the prostate was incurred after the patient had died, or in some cases at the removal of the prostate during surgery. But surgical results at the time were generally not very good, and many patients actually didn't even survive the surgery and the post-operation infections that were incurred. So the knowledge about the prostate was oftentimes taken from already deceased bodies that were then opened up and dissected, a type of knowledge production that had been going on for hundreds of years in Europe. If a person is on active surveillance, why should you even care about how knowledge about the was produced about the prostate historically, or even for that matter today? Well, I would claim that it's important because what we know about the prostate today is not all new knowledge, and how we know the prostate today is not either new knowledge. And this is where I think a lesson can be taken from women's activism on women's healthcare activism and the feminist critique of how medical knowledge is sometimes produced. Because one of the questions that's often asked in that sphere or in those discussions is, what is the history of whose knowledge is being produced about the prostate? Who is it that gets to decide what the prostate is, when it's diseased, and how to treat it? The picture on the left, the large anatomy picture, is an anatomical drawing. This one's from the 1940s, but it's similar to what you would see in a lot of medical textbooks today. It's produced and has traditionally been produced for hundreds of years by professionals who look at oftentimes already treated cadavers that are being dissected, and then try to sketch them in such a way that the colors and the artistic work pulls out what is considered the important characteristics of it. The prostate in this one is the little yellow, yellow-orangish bulge just below the big bladder, which you see up there and taking up the majority of the space almost. It's very discrete, in that there's like a distinct line around where it is and where it's not. It's also, important to think about in terms of how and where it's located to the other ones. And it's cut on the side, as in the rest of this body, is a cut through a dissection of the body. So you can see how and what it looks like on the inside as well. But that gives a very particular understanding of the body and how it's related to, for example, the anal cavity, the bladder, how it relates to the urethra. And this type of drawing would have been done from a dissected body, which is in the very middle button there in the screen. This is an image from an old Italian anatomy hall or theater, as it was called, where the people, the students, sometimes the paying public, would stand around, buy tickets to stand around and watch from above as the doctors or the surgeons dissected a corpse and pulled apart layer after layer after layer to show the different types of the ways that the body works. This is extremely important. This has given us a lot of knowledge about the anatomy. This has helped us understand how we are inside and what can be done, particularly surgically, to address that. But it also does mean that a lot of the knowledge, what we would call in my field, even the paradigm of knowledge about the body, is being produced in such a way, or being produced through the use of a scalpel. We know objects that can be easily cut apart, identified, dissected, and taken apart and removed. It's very good at giving understandings about unique, discrete organs. It's maybe not so good at giving knowledge about the interactions between those organs, especially in a living body. Now, of course, there are many, many other ways that we have knowledge about the prostate today as well, that we, and particularly the doctors that we encounter, use. So I'm not saying this is the only way that knowledge has been produced, but it is a very fundamental way of thinking about how knowledge is produced that talks about organs as unique and discrete, and also sees the organs from one particular viewpoint, from above, looking down onto the body, the outside looking in, the doctor looking at the patient. The image I have over in the right is a picture of a gynecological exam from the 1800s, one which shows the way that knowledge was being produced about the female body, often without even looking because it was so indiscreet, but from one person exploring and examining another body. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting to ask in terms of how knowledge about the prostate is being made and whose knowledge is not being incorporated into it. And this, I think, is something that one could ask using an understanding of what's happened in the last 40, 50 years in women's health. Everything from the initial 1970s epistemological critique, where groups of women started coming together and writing their own books about the body, Our Bodies Ourselves being one of the most famous ones, where they started saying, hey, look, medical institutions, doctors, surgeons, community, experts, we also live in our bodies. We want to use our bodies for particular things, and we also have a lot of knowledge about our bodies. I think that knowledge, said the women's activist critique, should be incorporated into our medical health care. And perhaps that type of questioning could also be relevant to think about prostate care. What about a man's knowledge about his body? How do men want to use their bodies during and after treatment for different types of prostate issues? Whose definition of what a healthy body is should be heard in discussions about healthcare? What care is good care? And who can decide what types of care are available to men? What is best practices, and whose best practices are they talking about? These are some of the lessons that women's healthcare activism brought forward that have, among other things, changed, for example, the shape and design of gynecological chairs, or changed the availability of treatments for different types of reproductive maladies, have offered different types of birth control, making different things available for women that tried to address women's use of their bodies outside of the clinical setting. But it also highlights a real conundrum, a real tension in the critique of the healthcare system. And that is that women have wanted, and I think men with prostate issues also want, more and better medical care, at the same time that they want that care to be not unnecessary, and particularly not unnecessary medicalization. And this balancing act is very difficult to do. And there I don't have an answer for how to do it, but I think it's an interesting conundrum to think through. What is better medical care? Is it always more care? And how can a person or a patient group try to change what's available there? Okay, so now I'm going to get off the soapbox and go back to the research results that we had and talk briefly about benign prostate hyperplasia and prostatitis. In these two parts of our studies, we looked at, for example, how benign prostate hyperplasia is diagnosed and then what type of treatments are available to it. I'll start there, I think. And I won't go on and on and on about it, although I do suspect that quite a number of the men who are part of ASPE are also probably concerned about BPH. And potentially, I think one of the interesting things we found was that looking through the medical guidelines, and here I analyzed both the European European Urology Association's medical guidelines for BPH and also the American Urological Association's guidelines for BPH, looking at how they think best practices is for diagnosing BPH. And one of the things that became really apparent was that the diagnostic practices were looking particularly at urination. Rightfully so. That's the symptom that usually brings most men to the clinic when BPH is discovered or diagnosed. But that it was very interesting from a medical sociology perspective to see how measurements of different urination practices, the speed at which a person can pee, or how much a person pees during the night, how much liquid is consumed during the day, how often a person gets up during the night to go to the bathroom, how long it takes to start, what the strength of the stream is. All of these questions were being translated into comments on or knowledge about the prostate itself. And that shift from taking and measuring a practice, a verb, urination, in different ways, and then transferring that into claiming that it says knowledge about the prostate was a really interesting shift. And I understand why it's being done. And I think oftentimes it is being done usefully and correctly. So I'm not saying that these guidelines are necessarily wrong, but I also seem to see in the material that there wasn't an awful lot of direct correlation between the size of the prostate and the problem of urination. At least not always. And that treatments were not always necessarily having an effect on the BPH to the extent that maybe one hoped that they always would. That it wasn't so easy to treat, especially with pharmaceuticals. And that sometimes it was treated and everything went really well. And sometimes it was treated and it didn't really make much of a change. And I started to wonder how the prostate was being implicated in all of these cases of urination measurements, and if maybe there was something going on there, and I don't have an answer. And that's going to frustrate you, and I realize that, and I'm sorry. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, but I thought there was something really interesting there, especially because at the same time that I was doing that work on BPH, I started to hear more and more stories of men who were being diagnosed with prostatitis, which is a diagnosis that we're not really supposed to, I shouldn't say I'm not a doctor, but that doctors are not necessarily encouraged to use in Sweden anymore, but it is still being used quite a bit because it does tend to work as an umbrella term or a catch-all for a lot of patients who present with oftentimes pain, diffuse pain, but also urination issues to their general practitioner, which is the way that we get healthcare in Sweden. First, you present to your general practitioner, and then your practitioner will write a prescription to see a specialist. So the urologists were getting referrals from general practitioners for bodies who presented with diffuse pain and urination issues. And those bodies also had a prostate, and they would be referred to the urologist, who would then start looking at whether or not that person had prostatitis, and if antibiotics, for example, could be a way of dealing with that. However, I was thinking about those same bodies, not those same bodies, but bodies that would present with those same two issues, urination issues and pain diffuse in the lower regions, if they didn't have a prostate, where they would go, because lots of bodies do present with that. And they would, in the Swedish system, very often be referred to a gynecologist who would give a completely different treatment trajectory for those patients. We started to think about, when analyzing this, what the diagnosis of prostatitis could do, how it interacted with understandings of masculinity, because all of a sudden it was then being related to things about getting cold and damp when fishing or sailing or riding the motorcycle without the long underwear, and what types of masculinities were being associated with that, and then how those could be then treated with antibiotics, which unfortunately do not cure the majority of patients who present with prostatitis. And here again, I thought what we were seeing was the prostate sort of taking the fall for cases where something was obviously wrong and the body had a prostate. And there again, we could refer back to this discussion of maybe it's the prostate that's haunting him as a way of finding or trying to find a solution, a reason for the problem, and then a solution by addressing that prostate. And this refers back to the whole discussion about why does it matter how we produce knowledge about the prostate? Why does it matter that we have anatomy books that put the prostate in the body right there and claim that it is a discrete unit gland that could potentially be a node or a target of treatment? It matters because then it becomes a target of treatment. And I think what we can start to see is that it becomes a target of treatment a lot of times for things that it maybe isn't really doing. Now you're probably thinking, okay, I'm on active surveillance. Why do I care? I'm going to say you should care because you're actually on active surveillance for a prostate issue, and the prostate there and how we know it is also still extremely relevant, and how your doctors know it is still extremely relevant. So here I'm going to go back to a story that an uncle of mine told me. He had prostate issues a while back, and because of the treatment that he chose for those issues, he had to annually go back to his doctor, his urologist, and get an annual checkup to see if the prostate was growing. And he said the last time, when I talked to him about this was a couple of years ago, but the last time that he had been back to the urologist for the digital rectal exam, the exam that we all joke about, his doctor had used 2 fingers instead of 1. And then at the end of his exam, he had asked his doctor, he's like, oh, I noticed you used 2 fingers this time. Is there something particular that you were concerned about? Was there a reason for that? At which point his doctor sat back and thought for a moment and said, no, I guess I just wanted a second opinion. Okay, that was a joke. I'm trying to lighten it up. There was a joke he told me, and it was one of many jokes that men told me throughout the course of this study, at dinner table parties and at interviews, and when I would just be talking to somebody about the study that I was doing, and there would always be a joke about the digital rectal exam. And I think back to all of the bad Hollywood films I've seen, and a lot of them have jokes about the digital rectal exam and the glove and the snapping of the glove. And then I would talk to urologists, especially the older ones, who would say in an off moment, you know, it took me many years to figure out how to lighten the mood enough to get this examination done, because the men come in and they just start joking about it. And it's obvious that there's a lot of anxiety about this exam. And there is a lot of anxiety about the prostate in general and about this exam in particular. And I'm going to share with you one moment from our field work that was particularly succinct. One of the anthropologists I had working with me had done a study prior to coming to working for this one, where she had followed Swedish medical students as they learned how to become midwives and gynecologists. So taking this course on examining the female body. And at the hospital she was working at, they had professional patients who allowed the medical students to examine the female body for the bimanual pelvic exam, which is where you put the fingers in the vagina and start feeling around to see that everything's okay and there's no cysts growing on it. And it's a very sensitive exam for the patients. It's also a very difficult exam to teach because you have to trust that the student knows what they're feeling when they feel it. And for a lot of younger students, it's not the easiest exam to learn how to do, and maybe there's a lot of emotional baggage coming with that student too. It's a bit embarrassing. It's a very sensitive part of the body. As my anthropologist was watching these students learn how to do that exam as medical students in a medical school, she realized how much the whole exam teaching moment was embedded in a way of talking about the female body and the female patients as if they were extremely special and sensitive, might be coming to the exam with past baggage from that area of their body, but also that they had to be gentle and caring to those patients, and had to be really clear about what they were doing and talking about it in a sensitive way. So sensitive patients were being produced in that exam moment. Then I got that same anthropologist to come and work with me and follow urology students, medical students who were taking their first urology classes, when they would do the rounds, and see how they were taught to do the digital rectal exam. And she came back to the office after doing the field work, and she's like, wow, of course, nobody's being impolite or rude, but there is none of this conversation about the patient being afraid, about the patient being uncomfortable, about the intimacy and invasiveness of the exam and trying to make everything comfortable, or maybe the patient has like past experiences that are making this exam even more difficult. None of that existed. Rather, it was all done in a very straightforward, perfunctory way, where the patient came in, the exam was done, the medical knowledge was recorded, and then everything was talked about afterwards. They were doing a male patient as if the male patient was just a man who was going to take it like a man and then be done with it. And that might be exactly what the majority of male patients want. I'm not saying it's not. But it is really interesting to me and to our team to think about how the medical encounter at that moment produces very, very different expectations of the patient's fears and the patient's emotions. I don't have a way of saying this is one way that we should rethink about it. I do, however, in the material that I got in the interviews with the urologists, have older urologists who have reflected on the fact that maybe they have learned a lot during their years of practice on how to help the patients feel more comfortable in that exam. And maybe we could, through thinking about that, even change the way new urology students are being taught to do the exam and what types of expectations are made there. Okay, so that was my soapbox again. That was my second soapbox. First one being, I think we need to think about whose knowledge of the body is being engaged when prostate issues appear. The second one being, how are doctors being taught to approach prostate patients, and what kind of good care is good care? What kind of care is good care? The third place that I want to talk about results from our study, and I'll end up with like a little soapbox at the end of this one, is how to think about the absent prostate and its extreme presence. And in our research, we had, like I said, the woman who was working as a sexual therapist at the urology clinic, and I paired her up with a medical sociologist who's looked a lot at ethical issues of care. And the two of them did several interview studies with men who have had various types of prostate cancer and also BPH treatments, although they mostly focused on prostate cancer, in anywhere from 1 to 10 years prior to the interviews. And they talked about both incontinence, but then also impotence. And I think that in the cultural understanding of prostate cancer and prostate treatments, these are the two big fears, impotence and incontinence. Now I'm going to be extremely Swedish, so excuse me, and I'm just going to use talk about sex in ways that I hope don't offend too many people. But what they found was that in their studies, which looked both at men who identified as heterosexual and at men who identified as homosexual, that in both of these studies, the prostate treatments tended to have a big and severe effect on impotence, but that maybe impotence is a word that should be broadened to contain much more than just erectile dysfunction. And I think a lot of medical treatments for post-prostatectomy sexual issues tend to focus on erectile dysfunction and different ways of trying to figure out how to produce an erection, which is all great and good. But when unpacking their material, it became really clear that regardless of what type of sexual identity the men in their interviews had, there was a wide variety of previous and present sexual experiences, and that different types of erections were needed for different types of activities. Some activities require a much harder and firmer erection than others, and also that there were different responses to the change in ejaculatory practices. A lot of times treatments will leave a person with dry ejaculations, and some people found that more difficult than others. Likewise, some treatments will have an impact on sexual desire, and some people found that much more difficult than others. And some of this was influenced by which sexual practices a person wanted to engage in, but some of it was also influenced by what types of relationships a person was actively engaging in. If they were in a long-term monogamous relationship with a partner, if that partner had personal experience of prostate cancer or other types of cancer, or had, all types of different partnerships appeared. But then also people who were single and were out looking for partners experienced impotence, and its different varieties very differently too. So this really pointed out that in dealing with post-operative often, but also the other treatments as well, post-prostate treatments, bodies, their patients and men and their partners could really benefit from an understanding of sexual practices that recognized much more or thought about much more than just, say, vaginal penetration as sex. And that by encouraging a wider perspective and discussion about what types of sexual practices a person wanted to engage in after their treatment, the treatment would be better serving those patients. So I guess this is my one thing here, is to say that actually prostate patients are men, and men is a giant category that contains lots of different types of people with lots of different social backgrounds and social situations and practices. And that maybe just as the category woman is way too broad to be useful for thinking about how to create women's health. That's one of the things we've learned in women's health activism, is that there are lots of different women with lots of different class and race and geographical and age backgrounds. Same with men, and trying to think about the diversity in that category is really important. Now, the other thing that comes up in interviews with men who have had a prostate removed or surgically or chemically or pharmaceutically or radiationally destroyed is incontinence. And this appeared in my interview material a lot, much more than I even thought it would. And one of the things that really became super apparent was that the men I was speaking with and interviewing were very aware of where all of the public toilets were and which bus rides they could take before it would get too long and they would probably have to use a toilet and they would be stuck, or which car rides they could take and which gas stations had good toilets, or which movie theaters they could go to, or which shows they would dare to do, or which flights they might want to take. Everybody was aware of where the toilets were and which toilets they need and how often they would need them. Probably like was mentioned in the introduction to today's talk, many of the men who are here listening today on active surveillance may eventually transition to treatment. And at that point, it's possible that both incontinence and impotence are issues that might appear. And being able to think through how to deal with them is good. Being able to think about which kinds of care a person can seek or demand from your medical community is also good. But I also think, and this is my last soapbox for the talk, I think it's valid to ask how much of the post-prostate treatment body's changes are the individual's responsibility and how much we as a community or a collective can try to address this. Because one of the things that the psychologists I interviewed, I interviewed not very many, but I've interviewed a couple psychologists who deal with men who have had different prostate issues, often prostate cancer. And one of the things that they came back to again and again was that it's not unusual for men who are dealing with prostate issues to find themselves being isolated, to find that they maybe themselves are reducing their social activity, are traveling less, are maybe afraid of going to those shows or those baseball games or those events that they know are going to take longer, where there's going to be a lot of lines at the toilet, or maybe it's just going to be a long row of urinals and that's not what they need at the moment. And I started to think that maybe those concerns could be addressed collectively as well. And of course, I think if we can find ways to help mitigate the side effects of surgery and help reduce the amount of incontinence that men deal with, or find a way to treat incontinence when they deal with it, we should definitely do that for the individual and looking at their body and the individual's body. But I think we can also collectively try to think about how we design our physical environment, especially in the public space. And I know that there are different prostate cancer groups who have actively gone out and made apps for various cities where you can use an app and download it so you know where the toilets are whenever you need to. I know that we can start talking about how we design men's bathrooms, for example, increasing the number of stalls that have doors so that a person can change an incontinence pad if they need to, or change a catheter if they need to in privacy. And I know also that we can start talking about whether or not those stalls have individual repositories for used incontinence pads. These types of things we can actively join together to try to change. And that might be something we want to do. So anyway, the absence prostate's presence is really, really strong in the material that we studied. For active surveillance, I think it's important to remember that this is going to be experienced differently by everybody. There's this whole intersectional approach that looks at how people's different geographical locations and availability of care is important to think through, but also things like how much access to care class or race has, what sort of networks and social care they have. And more importantly, that there is a really strong importance to organizing, which I think ASP is doing really well. It also creates this feeling of not being alone, but it also creates a voice that can possibly help to change what types of care are available and what types of physical spaces we live in. So I'm going to stop there and open for questions. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to something that is not medical, and yet maybe of slight relevance to the type of journeys that your bodies are going on. Thanks.
Well, Ericka, thanks. And, I do think that some of the guys in the chat have been resonating with some of the things that you brought up. We didn't know, what kind of response that we would get, but I wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to enter in, and we're not doing a hard sell on your book, sorry.
No, don't, no, yeah.
But if somebody was interested in buying it, I just put in the chat where they can get a discount. So that's the ASP discount. We don't get anything back. Any rate, I'd like to open up with a couple of questions. Okay, there's the guys with more advanced disease, and then there's the guys who are on active surveillance with low risk through favorable intermediate risk disease. And I wonder, as a social scientist, not as an MD, but as somebody who observes the social science aspect of this, why it is that funding for research on active surveillance and just even paying attention to the issues of active surveillance gets such a low priority on the part of, let's say, the Prostate Cancer Foundation, which I like to call the Advanced Prostate Cancer Foundation. They do a lot of good work, but they don't pay much attention to us. I mean, The only thing I can think of is do people with more advanced disease just by nature get more attention? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, and I might be wrong here with prostate cancer, but I think that it isn't all that long ago that we started to even differentiate between different understandings of cancer and its progression. And maybe the whole way of thinking about some categories of prostate cancer patients as being more advanced and others as being less threatening is relatively new. So I think partly maybe you're still fighting an uphill battle to get these types of terms recognized potentially. But I think you're probably right, Howard, that maybe a person who has very advanced prostate cancer is perhaps going to be more needy in terms of care and cancer treatment. I think there are lots of different things functioning in there that will make this the case.
Another housekeeping thing, if the guys can enter in their name box what country they're from, because I noticed that for the first time we've had people from Germany, Wales, and Lebanon. So we're up to about 20 different countries that have shown up, people from 20 different countries. But Mark, do you want to pick up the ball or should I keep going?
Why don't you ask another question, and then I have a few I can ask. There's a number of comments in the chat. If people want to look at the chat, they can see some of the comments. Not so many questions, more comments. But go ahead, Howard. Ask another one.
Yeah, you mentioned the Swedes and sexuality, but let me ask you about transsexual women. They retain their prostates, and it causes all kinds of anxiety for them when they go into the doctor's office, because the clerks ask, what's your birth name, and it causes all kinds of discomfort and fuss. And I wonder if you ran into any issues for transsexual women who have prostates.
I think the sad part of the answer to that question is that I didn't, because there was very little research that I could find about it, because there needs to be so much more research done on it. So when I did the literature reviews of studies on transsexual women with prostate cancer, the majority of studies that I could find looked specifically at the interactions between, for example, hormones and hormone treatments, and then cancer treatments. And I think that's extremely relevant, and that should definitely be studied. But it was not looking at how the women themselves were experiencing the care or the types of encounters they were receiving when they were getting the care. I found one interview that I cite in the book with a woman who was diagnosed with prostate cancer, a transsexual woman who was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and her response to the medical advice that she was given. But it's just one interview, and it wasn't one that I did myself either. So I think what I want to say here is that there is a real need for doing more of these studies.
But
I'm not the person to do it, because I'm not trans myself either. I think we also have to be really careful of including the voice of trans women in that research too. So it's a delicate balance there.
So I'm going to make an appeal to Mark to open his mind and not just talk about brothers of the prostate, because there are sisters too. Okay, Mark?
You've been heard, Howard. Could I ask a question now?
I wish you would.
I will. Again, there's a number of different good comments in the chat box. Not so many questions, but good comments. So I'm going to ask, Sweden is way ahead of the United States in terms of men going on active surveillance. Up to 90% of the population is going on active surveillance. And some people here say it's because it's, quote, socialized medicine. my own instinct is it's probably just good medicine and not over treatment. And it really has nothing to do, well, it really has to do with excellence in medicine. What is your opinion on that?
Well, again, because I'm a medical sociologist, I am always thinking about structures and structures of care and how care is both financed and provided, and what ways, where and how patients will encounter care, and how that care then is also being governed by different policymakers. Sweden tends to try to have a fairly uniform care provision across the whole country. And one way of doing that is by having different policy bodies and both policy and also suggested bodies, like guideline bodies, making decisions about what is good care, and then trying to pump out that message to all of the clinics around the country. There's a real political ideology that everybody should have access to the same quality care, no matter where they live and no matter what job they have. And so the way to do that, of course, is to try to find some sort of uniform decision about what good care is. And I would think that that has an effect also on how, for example, men who are diagnosed with low-risk cancer care will be encountering their doctors, because those doctors will have also had access to the agreed upon guidelines. So I think uniformity of care is easier to do in a system like the one that Sweden has. But here I've got to say also we've got an easy ride because we are a country of just over 10 million, and there are many cities in the US that have that many people, not many, but there's cities, so it's a very small group that you have to communicate with and try to get on board. But it seems to work many ways.
If I can butt in, Mark, Tim Shreve brings up a good point about the American Neurological Association. We try not to be too American oriented, but we do know in the United States that gay men feel as unwelcome in the typical urology office as do transsexual women. I mean, there's sort of a macho thing going on with a lot of the urologists, at least the male urologists. And so, we have contacts, Mark has contacts, and maybe we should make a special effort to make them aware of these issues and of this program. And I was very impressed from our first German visitor, Gerald Silverberg, talking about the economics of prostate cancer. And, the way that the doctors are compensated affects their incentives. So it's true in Germany, it's true in the United States, it's true in Sweden. And, if there's an emphasis placed on, doing procedures and getting paid more for doing procedures will be done. In Sweden, Ericka, maybe you have some comments about compensation and how it affects treatment choices. And you kind of hinted at this in Sweden, how things are a little bit different, but maybe you can give a plug for the Swedish system or a criticism.
I mean, I have a lot of good things to say about the Swedish healthcare system. I know that it gets a bad rap over in the States, but actually I'm really impressed with it. But doctors get a salary, they don't get paid per patient or per procedure. They just get a monthly salary.
This is Mark again. Gerald from Berlin, you have a good comment in the chat. Do you want to unmute yourself and share what you shared in the chat? I think maybe that's worth hearing your voice, if you're comfortable. Are you comfortable unmuting?
Yeah, sure. I have no problem with that.
Good.
As the speaker pointed out, the incentive, several speakers have pointed out, the incentive structure of any system, particularly the medical system, will govern how people will behave, unfortunately. And even medical doctors who were pledged to uphold the highest levels of impartiality will be very much affected by what they do. And I hate to say this because urologists themselves don't make money off a lot of these procedures. They refer you to clinics eventually if you're treated. But the clinics pay paybacks. And unfortunately, this is well known to judicial authorities, but it's very hard to investigate and punish. But in Germany, doctors are paid 800 euros under the table for referrals for radical prostatectomy. But radiation therapy, which is for every indication equally good in terms of overall survival and has a much lower risk profile, is paid about a third as much. So hospitals have no incentives to offer kickbacks to doctors.
Thank you for that.
If you look at the medical system, there are several levels of the medical system. At the higher level, at the highest levels, the people who put together the guidelines are fairly impartial. When you get to the lower levels of ordinary doctors who are making money, you find that these guidelines are often not adhered to at all. And it's rather shocking, in fact, to what extent very respectable urologists are not adhering to the guidelines of their own professional associations.
It's too bad. Are you a doctor? You sound rather knowledgeable.
No, I'm a patient. I've been in this business, the prostate business, for the last 4 years.
And you're in Germany.
High risk prostate.
For high risk. Okay. You're in Germany.
I'm in Berlin, yeah.
In Berlin, okay.
So as a patient, you have to read the guideline yourself and you have to investigate everything yourself. Unfortunately, I've had very good urologists, and yet my urologists were in flagrant contradiction to the guidelines in how they take the recommendations they gave me.
Well, it's interesting that you have the same issues that we have to a lot. And part of the message of ASPI is that we have to be CEOs of our own healthcare. And it sounds like in Germany, well, wherever in the world, really, you have to be the CEO of your own healthcare. But it's more compelling maybe in Germany and the United States, maybe, than other places. Let me thank you for that.
Can I add in there
Sure.
just real quick? I think that being the CEO of your own healthcare is really important, and being able to be strong enough to do that, of course, and aware that that's what you need to do. But here, I think groups like ASPI have a really strong role to play too. I see that you guys see that and are doing it, and I feel like I just want to lift that up as. I feel so happy to see it happening, because I think that this is the kind of patient activism that we've seen a lot in women's healthcare questions for years, for decades, and I'm really happy to see it happening here.
Well,
I'd like to throw out a plug for an upcoming meeting that we're going to do in April 24th. It's going to be this winter. There were two programs, one from Movember, the Australian Men's Health Group, and the other from University of Maryland and Prostate Cancer International, talking about the future of active surveillance. And so we're going to kind of open this all up to the whole can of worms in April, and you'll hear more about it. But Ericka, I was going to have a question for you about this activism thing and lessons learned from the women. And let me point out, recently I was invited to be a member of the advisory board to University of California, San Francisco, specifically on an active surveillance program for women with low-risk breast cancer. And apparently they haven't done such a good job about persuading women. Women seem to like to play the role of the survivor, the heroine. And a study in Australia found that women like to be called survivors. Men, even with advanced prostate cancer, don't like that. And I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but especially for guys on active surveillance like me and Mark, Mark Litch, he's very upbeat. He calls us thrivers rather than survivors. I just say, men or women with prostate cancer. And I just wonder, thinking about the women's model, why active surveillance for low risk breast cancer has kind of failed. Why women like to see themselves as survivors, and also how it is ASPE and some of our colleagues in other places can be more activist. Should we have die-ins or what should we do?
Wow. I mean, all of those questions are so relevant and so interesting and impossible to answer, partly because, here, Howard, you're doing again, you're using the term women as if that was one category of people. And I
they've been our role models.
Yeah.
In terms of activism and in terms of support.
Yeah.
And so, we honor them and we try to follow them, but they've not been totally a good model.
Well, and I think there can be a lot of lessons learned back and forth there. Eh? I mean, I think conversations about this in both directions would be really, really useful. And I think a lot of it comes back to that conundrum that I talked about earlier about wanting to have better care, which is often interpreted as having more access to care or more care, and at the same time wanting to be less medicalized. And how do you find that balance, and where is that balance, right? And what groups think, I mean, I think different groups think that balance is differently placed also. So but I just love that we can open up to a conversation about that and maybe even push back a little bit at the breast cancer activism and say, wait a minute, maybe we need to think again about how to define what breast cancer is and different treatment options. I don't know.
Let me ask a question before before I forget. So next month's program is on compassionate diagnosis, compassionate care. And I spoke of that in the introduction. So this is to you, Ericka, but it's to all people out there. We're looking for the best practice. We're looking for folks, when they were diagnosed, for example, they had immediate access to a nurse, immediate access to a social worker, some immediate access to a real institutionalized, let's call it institutionalized support individual. And my email, by the way, to the audience is in the chat room. And if you have any experience where that you may personally have had that experience, please email me, because we're looking for the best practice on that. Ericka, with regard to you, in your wanderings, did you come across anything like that where people were originally diagnosed, for example, they had access to a support person?
No, but
Okay.
but that's not going to, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think the reason that we didn't have it is because we looked specifically at the debate around the PSA as a screening tool versus as an individual testing tool. So I had one sociologist looking at that and discussions about risk. And then I had the two people who were working on post-prostatectomy treatments and sexual rehabilitation, among other things. So that would be two moments in the trajectory of care that are not at the moment of diagnosis. So I didn't actually have anybody looking at what happens in the clinical setting right at diagnosis. That is a problem with my study. I take that on board. We need to look at that better. But I didn't look at that, actually. No. I would guess that there is not as much of it as what needs to be done. I think that it's a very, very difficult moment. And the more support and care a person can receive there, the better. That type of, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I think I think in times of budget cuts, that's the type of care that gets cut first.
Sure.
Yeah, would be my guess. But I don't have data on it. So that's what I'm saying. My study is not sufficient there.
Okay.
Yeah, Ericka, I was pleased at many of the responses that we got in the chat. I didn't know, I'll say it again, I didn't know how a talk about the sociology of gender or sociology of medicine would go over from a crowd that craves information about, specific care issues. But Daryl up in British Columbia brings up point, the sociological view of medicine is unfortunately missing from medical education and practice. It must be brought back into the system. I don't know that it ever was in the system of medical practice. How can we demand this from our GPs or specialists? So I wonder, I took a lot of this kind of education at the University of Michigan, some in the medical school, some out, and I didn't notice, they did have a course on ethics in the medical school, but they didn't have medical sociology or anthropology in there. And I wonder, is it realistic to expect, any of this to penetrate the walls of the medical academy?
Yes, that's why I wake up every day. I know there's something more that I can do, and that's trying to get it out there. But it's not just me. I'm part of a Center for Medical Humanities, and there are several of those in Sweden. They're fairly recent. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've sort of started developing these centers at different universities, and we're using that organizational structure to try to access medical education and get lectures or sometimes even whole courses about the medical humanities in the education for medical students. It hasn't been 100% successful yet, but we feel that there are lots of these types of perspectives that, while they may not help with the actual diagnosis of one particular disease, may actually help with the production of medical doctors that we as the democracy want to have. So we're trying. And I think that there are lots of, I think this is in Sweden. I think in America too, there are lots of people who are holding these types of lectures for medical students. I hope that there can be even more soon, but I'm biased. I think
Thank you. I had a suggestion. We have a couple of minutes here. If anybody wants to raise their hand, you can go down to reactions and then click on that raised hands, and maybe we can deal with some of those questions.
You know what I could do? Also, I noticed that somebody said in the chat that there are people here who would be happy to talk about that. My study is done, but that does not mean I'm not interested anymore. So I'm going to just put my email in there, if that's okay with you guys. And anybody who wants to reach out is more than welcome to contact me. I can't guarantee I can do anything or say anything of interest, but if you want to reach out, here's my email.
Thank you. I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to, or Joe, am I missing raised hands? Or are we good?
Well,
Okay.
Tim has raised his hand, and Tim's had a lot of good things to say, and Jeff has raised his hand.
There we go. Okay, so there you go. I see. Now, yeah, we got Jeff. Okay. Well,
Yeah, why don't we go to Tim, even though he was second?
Yeah. Okay.
No offense to Jeff, but he's a board member.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I just wanted, before the meeting ended, to somewhere raise my hand and thank ASPI for a previous presentation, which was more towards last summer, which had to do with transperineal biopsies. And because of that information, when my need came up to have a second biopsy, I was able to find a doctor relatively local here in the United States that was able to use the new technique that you all presented, and the outcome and the experience was a whole universe different from my initial biopsy experience. So just wanted to throw that out there and give you guys some feedback on that. On the
Hey, well, Tim, we need all the love we can get.
okay,
And you raised a lot of good points in that we picked up on in the talk. And yeah, transperineal, we've been leading the way on it, and there's still problems. I started a newsletter, so I'm going to do a plug for myself. But the latest story in there is, an emerging pattern with this, because a lot of guys are going into the operating room to get transperineal, while others do it in the office. And well, I'm not selling any papers here, not yet, but take a look at it. Some of you might find it interesting because it's a whole new wrinkle on transperineal. But thanks, Tim.
Well,
Hey,
Howard, put a link to your to that in the chat box here. And,
yeah, I did.
Okay, good. Yeah, Howard has to Howard's credit. Howard is like the prostate maven of the globe. And,
Oh, what a great job that is.
and he's led the way on the transperineal, and we at ASPE are doing what we can as well. So, I mean, I personally, if I were going to I haven't had a biopsy. I mean, I was diagnosed with 17 years ago, and early on, I just couldn't figure out how there couldn't be some kind of infection or sepsis. So I actually quit having biopsies 16 years ago, and I never regretted stop having biopsy.
Hey,
Well,
Mark,
but
Jeff's hand was up.
Yeah, I'm recognizing Jeff as we speak. Jeff.
Hi, folks. Me again. This time I won't talk about politics and taxes. Hey, one of my pet peeves, Ericka, is every time I go into a medical office, dental, urologist, general practitioner, any specialist, they always give you this umpteen, several page questionnaire about family history. Well, gee whiz, my ripe age is 68. A lot of my progenitors and family are no longer on this earth. So how are we supposed to answer these kinds of questions, particularly when it comes to a history of urology in the family, with a background and in the United States that it wasn't until, the 70s or 80s, we even saw any kind of imaging of a man's genitals anywhere. I mean, I grew up in a fairly religious family, and it just didn't happen. So how are we supposed to do our family history?
Yeah. I wish I had an easy answer for you on that one, because I'm guessing that you don't know if your grandfather or his father had prostate cancer, because they simply didn't talk about that. And it's entirely possible that, depending on your background, that they didn't have access to the medical care that would have been necessary to even diagnose it. I would be my guess.
So there's no tests or any way we can find out?
No, you can do genetic testing, Jeff.
Well, yeah. But it's not going to tell Jeff what his grandparents died of. But yes, there's genetic testing. I wish I had a good answer for you there.
So maybe we need a little more education about genetic testing, is maybe where we need to be.
There's something I want to share here that Edward from Ireland passed along, and it's a study by an Irish group on prostate cancer. I'm going to post it. We try to support each other's research. And so I don't know if Edward wants to share a little bit more about this study, but it sounds like it may be worthwhile. Edward, anything to say from Ireland?
Yeah, thanks, Howard, for the platform. Antoinette Perry is a research scientist in University College Dublin. She's been working on the development of a test for aggressive prostate cancer. It's a liquid biopsy urine test. The idea is that it would reduce the number of prostate biopsies that men on AS would undertake. So this is very much an initial research piece to see how men are treated. The reason I suggested it might be relevant is it was prompted by the journey of the patient once they're first diagnosed and what happens. So that's really what the questionnaire is about. Tom Hand is also on the line, I think. Tom is actually with Men Against Cancer. He's probably got a good perspective on Antoinette Perry as well, so he would hopefully support that being circulated. But I appreciate, Howard, you circulated that.
Right. Well, is that Tom Hope you mean, or?
Tom Hope, yeah.
Okay, just so we get our Toms straight. So thanks, Edward.
Thank you, Howard.
Well, so it is now 151.
In some places.
131. What am I saying? 131. So, Ericka, you're you may leave unless we have some other questions. Does anybody else have questions they want to?
Actually, Ericka, you could have left at any time, but we are grateful that you didn't.
I'm really grateful that I was able to be invited here to speak. And thank you so much for everybody who came and listened and the comments. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And feel free to email me if you have any other comments you want to share offline.
Very much appreciated. Your presentation was excellent, and your energy was excellent. Much appreciated.